Hey guys, Sly here, and welcome back to another episode of the Caspian Game Awards. Okay, I gotta be real with you guys. Screw it with the pleasantries. This I was dreading to do. If I'm gonna be honest with you guys, I was absolutely dreading doing the research for this year in particular. So much so that straight up, I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. 1992 is easily one of the worst years we have had to have covered for this show. It's up there. It's up there with 2000. It's up there with 2015. It's up there with 2021. This year was horrible for gaming. And that's why I've been delaying the stream. To the point where I'm literally doing this and compromising otherwise what I would have done stream for the end of the year. Because it's New Year's Eve. I was going to have a huge stream where I was going to be collaborating with a bunch of people. But no! 1992 had to just, bounce right in and give me a hard time. So, if I'm going to be honest, this is not going to be a long episode. As a matter of fact, this is probably going to be the shortest episode because I really do not want to waste any more time with this. This episode broke me. Like, this year was just non-stop shitty movie license game after shitty movie license game after shitty movie license game after shitty sports game after shitty sports game after shitty sports game. Not to mention, this was the year that brought us the Sega CD, which there's some cool games that came out of that, even some guilty pleasures of mine, but oh my god, a lot of it was actual trash. Not to mention that, well, a lot of the games that came from, a lot of the games that you guys probably remember from a lot of your favorite YouTubers, like AVGN, or Peanut Butter Gamer, or JonTron, a lot of the shit that they've had to cover that was absolute ass came from 1992. So buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, because this is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. So, again, rules. Crash Thompson, give it away.
Don't yell at me, yell at the Grammys.
It's got to be from this year. You guys know the rules at this point. I don't think I need to repeat them. So let's just get this over with. So, and well, we've already reached our first problem. Well, our second problem, technically. The game by new studio I have not been able to find, because a lot of the games that were made around this time were not made by upcoming studios. And so because of that, I unfortunately had to axe that, which thankfully means we're only going to be having 7 categories this time around. But like I said, this year was actually terrible. So don't expect there to be a lot of games in a lot of these categories. That being said, this was not a completely doom and gloom year. Because, well, funny enough, easily the best category, without a shadow of a doubt, from this year was the role-playing game category. If you were a RPG fan, oh my god, 1992 was your year. I mean, the mid-90s has been, in general, pretty amazing, but 1992 was kind of the beginning of the golden age of the JRPG and even top-down RPGs. But that being said, every other category it was really, really hard for me to try to find stuff. and again, Wikipedia didn't even help. And even my Super Nintendo that I had here, because if you guys remember, I have a modded SNES Classic where I've been doing a lot of the research, a lot more hands-on, because this is a lot easier for me to be able to do the research with this. Even then, it's been a bit of a pain. Even the Super Nintendo itself, which I love the Super Nintendo, was really not able to save too much from this year. And truth be told, a lot of the games that people think came out in 92, they actually came out in 91, so they don't qualify for this year. So, yeah, I know I'm being extremely pessimistic and very negative at the very beginning of this. I do apologize. I do typically try to, like, you know, give a general feel, general vibe of the year that we're getting ourselves into. And I guess this is the vibe I've been having with this particular year in general. 1992 sucked. So, but either way, I guess we can buckle up. Because it's going to be a bumpy ride. So, again, we're not even going to waste time. Let's just start with the categories. Best Action Adventure Game. So, of course, you guys know this is going to be just your general action, your general adventure, your puzzle games, your horror games, all that fun stuff. And oh boy, was it a struggle trying to find enough games that had a decent amount of a rating that I thought was pretty cool. But, twist of fate, I was able to find just enough games. I even had to stretch a few games as, like, general category for them to be able to fit here. And by the way, keep in mind, typically I like to have the games done in chronological order, but a lot of these games don't actually have dates, like official dates released for them. And so keep in mind that the early 90s is going to be a bit scattered as far as me being able to figure out exactly when a game came out. That being said, these are all the games I ended up choosing for this category. Again, some of them are stretching how we've talked about, but I think ultimately these are good enough games from the year. Also, I just realized I did not type Mortal Kombat right there. Let me fix that. Again, this has been an absolute struggle trying to do this. But anyways, so what do we got here? So, first of all, we got ourselves Alone in the Dark, which is an extremely important game for a lot of reasons. And by the way, of course, keep in mind, we're not judging these based off of if these games really hold up to this day, because let's be real here, a lot of these games they were good for their time, but they probably aged poorly. But even then, these are good enough games in my opinion. So anyways, Alone in the Dark. This is a very important game for a lot of reasons, as this was amongst one of the first, if not the first, survival horror game to ever exist. And it was a moderate success. Having being set in a haunted house where you're fighting against a bunch of like monsters and ghouls, and even like a dark entity that surrounds the house. Even though it's not scary nowadays, I still consider it to be a very important game, and for its time, it was pretty innovative. So we're gonna nominate it here. Next up, Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. A somewhat of a movie tie-in game, kind of, but this was, at least in my opinion, the first kind of good Indiana Jones game. It's more of a graphic adventure game, so LucasArts, taking in what they learned from their Monkey Island games, applied a lot of the same formulas into Fate of Atlantis, and so it plays more in line with something like that. And honestly, that's probably one of the better ways you could have translated Indiana Jones into a game at the time. And so because of that, I am going to give it a bit of respect. And also giving a bit more of a cool, lesser-known story of Indiana Jones into the spotlight of a game. I don't know, I just think that's pretty cool. Which, speaking of point-and-click adventure games, we got ourselves King's Quest 6. This came out 2 years after King's Quest 5. And again, this is kind of more of a general adventure game. I think this was actually the first reboot game, because it's not with the same king. It's with a completely different cast. And honestly, that was kind of something that was needed by this point, because they've just been following King Graham the entire series. So it makes sense for them to finally start branching out by this point, because King's Quest has been a series since the mid-80s. Actually, I think early 80s now I think about it. So a much needed change of pace, I'd say. And then we got Super Double Dragon. I'm pretty sure this is the first Double Dragon that was on Super Nintendo. A massive, massive improvement compared to Double Dragon 3. As far as beat 'em ups are concerned, this one is definitely one of the better ones on the SNES. I think that it is. It's just an overall. It's basically just a graphical improvement upon what the first two games offered, plus some. There's some new abilities that you can use around, since obviously you've got a bit of a bigger controller to mess around with. So obviously they want to implement as much as they can here, and it's just overall a pretty decent little experience. So. Which, speaking of a little decent experiences, with Super involved with them, and LucasArts kind of, we got Super Star Wars. The first game in the Super Star Wars trilogy that was released for Super Nintendo, which were basically just straight up video game adaptations of the movies. And this is probably the first good Star Wars game that's ever been made, if I'm gonna be honest. Obviously, there were plenty made throughout the 80s and the early 90s on like the Atari, the Super Nintendo, like the NES, even like some arcade games here and there. But this one actually, I feel like, not only looks visually up to par, it's also a genuinely really good shoot 'em up with some vehicle sections here and there. And I just find it to be a pretty fun experience. Even if there's some weird liberties that they had to take with some of the source material in this, it's still kind of cool just being able to blast a bunch of different wild, like alien creatures and stormtroopers and stuff like that. And then, last but not least, we got the game that's probably stretching it the most on here, but considering we don't have a sports racing fighting game category anymore, I had to nominate it here. It just felt wrong for me to not nominate it. We got Mortal Kombat. Another very important game as far as major video game releases. Obviously, this was the direct arcade competitor to Street Fighter at the time. And, I mean, was rather infamous. It was one of the games that did lead to the eventual creation of the ESRB rating system that we know today. But even just besides a lot of the controversies, it's just still a pretty decent little arcade fighting game that is very hard nowadays, of course, but makes sense for what it was at the time. And being one of the first games that you just digitized actors, which is kind of funny in hindsight. Again, the early to mid 90s, like there were a lot of games in the 90s that just had digitized actors. But this was one of the few ones I felt like actually worked with the environments. And, well, like I said, just the overall combat itself, I think it's pretty fun. So, and that's coming from someone who doesn't really care for fighting games outside of Soul Calibur. So, yeah, but again, let's just not waste any time. Let's go over the winner. This might be a controversial pick, but at the end of the day, this is how I personally feel. So, the award for the best action-adventure game of 1992 goes to Alone in the Dark. Most people will probably choose Mortal Kombat, but considering that I'm not the biggest fighting game guy, and also I think I overall prefer survival horror games as a whole. I think I had to choose this one. So obviously, being the first game in the genre, obviously that is extremely important, because without this, we wouldn't have Resident Evil, and by extension, we wouldn't have Silent Hill, and by extension, we wouldn't have a bunch of other survival horror games. And so this is a very important game in that respect. And even just besides the importance of that, I do think that this was a pretty big step as far as other genres as well, because this game relied on a lot of puzzle solving, which was not common with a lot of these types of games at the time. And as far as I'm concerned, this was one of the first games to utilize 3D graphics. It being a PC game for DOS computers at the time, the allowance of more graphical fidelity, I think, was something that, yes, it's probably aged poorly now, but for at the time, was actually pretty impressive. And even a lot of the 2D backgrounds that you're walking around do look pretty good, especially when you go down to the basement area. Or even just the intro area. So, overall, this is what I would personally choose. Even if, it's one of those games that's definitely of its time. Alright, best platformer. This was another category that was really hard for me to figure out. Because again, there were a lot of just not very good mascot platformers that were being made at the time that were basically just cashing in on the popularities of both Sonic and Mario. And so it was really slim pickings for this one. That being said, though, I do think ultimately what I chose are going to be the ones that are the best representatives for this year. And this is why I ended up choosing. So, first of all, we got ourselves Alicia Dragoon, which was a sort of action platformer that was released for the Sega Genesis, that I thought was a game that was pretty decent as far as the environments and the controls. Obviously, I'm more of a fantasy junkie, and so because of that, I am going to be biased when it comes to fantasy games. And it's just overall pretty decent as far as like those types of platformers are concerned. So, and yes, I am very well aware that is a very early 90s as hell cover. Don't worry, it is more than just, that. So, next up we got ourselves Flashback, a cinematic platformer that took heavy inspiration from 1989's Prince of Persia, except being set in a more science fiction setting and no timer, which is a massive thing for me because a lot of platformers, or just a lot of games in general at this time period, relied heavily on timer mechanics. So having a game that was a lot more of your pace type of game, I thought was pretty cool. And even a lot of the animations in this game, honestly, for whenever this came out, were very impressive. So, naturally, I want to give it a lot of credit. And then we got ourselves Mega Man 5, which I am very well aware this may not be a lot of people's personal favorites, especially since by this point, Mega Man was starting to feel a lot like very samey. Though that doesn't take away from the quality that Mega Man overall had. It's just there were just a lot of Mega Man games that were being made at the time. That being said, let's not beat around the bush. It is still a quality game, especially for a lot of other platformers that were still being made for the NES at the time. Because yes, the NES was still being made. Like, the NES games were still being made in 1992. So having a game at least stand out in comparison to other games around that time period on that console in its late stage is only fair enough for us to talk about. And then we have ourselves Super Mario Land 2. This is the Game Boy representative on the list. And typically when it comes to original Game Boy games, I've always preferred the first-party games compared to, any game that was specifically made by Nintendo or licensed by Nintendo as, a first or second-party game. typically were the best games for the Game Boy. And this is one of those examples where it offers a decent Mario experience that, yes, is downscaled, but is still a decent experience nonetheless. And so, because of that, I wanted to give it a nod. And then, last but not least, we got ourselves World of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse. This is the sequel to Castle of Illusion, and so pretty much all the positives that came from that game also apply here. Good use of visual graphics, a lot easier of a platformer to control overall, and well, you see right there you can swap between both Mickey and Donald, which is pretty nice. So again, not the most well-known names. It's about like 50-50. But I would still think these are definitely the best choices that we've got here. Because trust me, I've played a lot of platformers in the past several weeks trying to figure out which ones to choose. And ultimately, these were the best ones. But what's going to be the winner? Well, let's figure that out now. So, the award for the best platformer of 1992 goes to Flashback. Again, a lesser known name, but a game that I think is pretty impressive nonetheless. Of course, it being a cinematic platformer, it relied heavily on its fluid animations for it to be able to actually function, and it worked for the most part. There's some weird, quirky inconsistencies, but it is a game that ultimately paved the way for something like Oddworld Apes Odyssey, or even just other types of more action-adventure-y platformer hybrid games to come out. And so because of that, I do have to give it a bit of praise. Also, this game has a lot of backstory to it. There's a lot more of a general sense of a world in this game, which was just straight up not very common with a lot of other platformers. Typically, when a lot of platformers at the time, they don't really try to expand beyond it just being, just some sort of kid's game. Or I guess in some of these platforms cases, this isn't a kid's game. But being able to have other characters that are around the world that aren't hostile and being able to interact with them was something that was definitely unique for this time period. And so having some of that NPC interaction and a platformer, yeah, I gotta give credit where credit is due. And being a shooter-based platformer, that just wasn't a thing. So, Flashback, good. Also, bonus points for the PC version for having modern amenities. Not the remake, the original version that's on Steam. It has the common amenities, which is always nice. So it's not a completely uncumbersome experience. So that's that's the version I prefer you guys play. And then we got the RPG category, which I'm going to be frank here, there's going to be a few snubs. There were just so many games released in this year that it's going to be impossible. As a matter of fact, this is easily the best category that we'll be covering. It's not even a contest. There were so many great JRPGs, Western RPGs to have chosen. However, you guys know the drill at this point. I can only choose up to 6. And so because of that, there's going to be some snubs. But these are the ones I ended up deciding to choose, though they're in the wrong order. God. I'm sorry, this was a struggle trying to actually get myself to work on the slideshow. So if there's inconsistencies in the slideshows themselves, I sincerely apologize. That's how much I was really trying to not do this whole thing. But anyways, so first off, we've got ourselves Romancing Saga. Funny enough, this was originally supposed to be another Final Fantasy game, but it eventually spun into its own thing, its own world, being more influenced by a lot of ancient Greek and Roman mythology compared to Final Fantasy, which was just kind of more of your generic high fantasy setting. A game that was a bit more involved with its taking a lot of inspiration from a lot of mythological sources, was something that was pretty interesting at the time. And I think it worked. So, yeah. Romancing Saga. Very interesting game. Keep in mind, though, this did not release in North America for the longest time. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure the English translations weren't even, official English translations weren't released until literally, last year, 2023, which is insane. But I played a fan translation of the original version on Super Nintendo, and I think it's pretty cool in its own regard. So I'm gonna give this a recommendation. Next up, we get ourselves Soul Blazer, which is the first game in that sort of weird JRPG trilogy that was made at the time by Quintet. It's in the same lineage of Illusion of Gaia and Terranigma. This just so happened to have been the first game in that sort of little trilogy that they were doing at the time. And as far as Japanese action RPGs are concerned, this is a pretty important game, as it was one of the first games to actually do that, having more real-time combat as opposed to the turn-based combat of a lot of the other JRPGs at the time. And just overall, having a bit more of a more Western influence in its general look. Not very common with a lot of JRPGs. So, yeah, I'm willing to give it some praise. And then we got ourselves Dragon Quest V, which god damn it. I need to fix... This is not going to happen in the next episode, by the way. 1991 is going to be an objectively better year than freaking 1992. I'm just going to be straight up about that. And I already know it's going to be a better year. But this was a drag. Okay, there we go. Okay. Dragon Quest V. This was another game that was not released in North America, but was just an overall solid improvement compared to every other Dragon Quest game released before, because the first 4 Dragon Quest games were released on the NES, this being the first Super Nintendo game. Obviously, the graphics are going to look better. The general combat is going to feel a lot better. The actual story is going to be a lot more cohesive. And just overall offers a pretty good, solid experience all around. And honestly, kind of the same thing with Final Fantasy V. Another game that was not released in North America. It was only released in Japan at the time, but is still a just solid enough of an experience that really isn't that different from Final Fantasy IV. And I guess I also feel bad about this game, especially because I feel like this is kind of one of the more forgotten games in the Final Fantasy, the legacy of this franchise. And that sucks, because it is a pretty good game, all things considered. I guess it's just the fact that it was sandwiched between 4 and 6, which were very important games in their own regard. This one was just kind of one of the ones that ended up being forgotten about. But I don't think that's fair at all. Because as far as some of the things that they introduced and the general and also this being one of the last true Final Fantasy games to be made for a good while, I have a bit of a soft spot for it, and so I wanted to give it a nod. And then we got ourselves the very first Shin Megami Tensei. Again, another JRPG series that has some inspiration from a lot of mythos, but also takes a lot of cues from more contemporary environments, which again, not the most common thing at the time, though there were all in this game's case, it still has some of that typical fantasy look. And as far as just, again, this is just another overall solid JRPG. Again, only roots in Japan. I know there's a lot of Japanese only releases here, but I want to make sure that I got them for 1992 and not 1993 and 94, because again, we do official initial releases here. And as far as being somewhat of a spin-off of an already established franchise, just a decent enough. And then last but not least, we got ourselves the only Western RPG that's on this entire list. We got ourselves Ultima 7, The Black Gates. Highly regarded by many to being one of the best Ultima games, just straight up. And for good reason. The amount of freedom and choice that the player is given in this game is honestly very impressive. And this game predates a lot of games that are known for their sense of player's choice. Just being able to, be able to kill like whatever NPC you want, being able to do whatever action that you so desire in the game. That sense of just player choice, for a lot of games, that just wasn't really a thing. I'm pretty sure Ultima as a series was like the only series that was doing it at the time. And so, then yeah, I know the cover sucks. It's literally just a black background. This is the actual official release cover of it. I don't know. The game is a lot more colorful than this. I can guarantee you that. But even just kind of besides that, some of the cool implementations of some of the staple characters, like the Guardian, being in here, also introducing 3D mechanics, I do find it be pretty impressive. So yeah, but let's go over the winner. A lot of good choices, but let's see who wins here. So, the award for the best RPG of 1992 goes to Ultima 7. I know this is the only Western RPG and it won, but here's the thing about this game that I do find it to be impressive and also very important. Again, I have to emphasize the sense of freedom of player's choice that this has compared to literally every other RPG that came out at the time. The fact that you can actually literally do anything that you want in a open world game in 1992, mind you, that's a sign of that this game was definitely ahead of its time. I don't usually like saying that, but the fact that this game was able to allow you to be able to do all that, pretty impressive. Also, the fact that this game also was one of the first RPGs to implement 3D mechanics and 3D graphics. Obviously, that is something that does have a bit of an edge with a game like this. And so I feel like that's also at least worth noting, as well as introducing some franchise staples that would be stuck with Ultima from this point onwards. Like I said, the main antagonist being the Guardian. a very important antagonist for this point onwards. And even a lot of smaller technical things that were heavy improvements compared to other Ultima games, specifically changing up a lot of the messy UI that was kind of a problem with a lot of computer RPGs. This was one of the games that tried to streamline a lot of that, and it worked out pretty well. So, yeah. Ultima 7. Alright. Shooter games. I'd say this is probably the second best category for this year. Because there were a lot of shoot 'em up games that came out this year that were pretty fun to mess around with. And there are going to be a few that did get snubbed. So do keep that in mind. But as far as arcade shoot 'em ups are concerned, 1992 was a fairly impressive year in that regard. But what did I end up choosing? Well, first of all, we got ourselves Desert Strike: Return to the Gulf. Yeah, why not? Let's just capitalize on a war that literally just happened the previous year. That's fine. God, this is so dumb. Yes, despite the fact that it's really dumb that a game literally jumped on the train of making a Persian Gulf War game, it's actually the funniest part about this is that it's actually an unironically really fun shooter as far as vehicular based like shoot 'em ups are concerned. This is actually one of the better ones on the Super Nintendo, and it kind of gives me a lot of weirdly enough, it kind of gives me a mixed vibe between both 1943 and Xevious, which is kind of I know that's kind of a weird thing to compare them like this to, but considering that, if I'm going to be honest, those are some of my favorite typical like side-scrolling shoot 'em, like vehicular-based shooter games. I think it works in this game's case. So yeah, weirdly enough, a pretty good game based off the Gulf War, which I know is like a rare thing. I mean, I can literally think of the games that were set in the Gulf War literally on my fingers. Freaking this game, the stupid Action 52 mini game thing, the one mission from Splinter Cell Conviction, and Black Ops 6. Literally the only 4 games that I can think of off the top of my head that are taking place in the Gulf War. But thankfully this one actually is pretty good, so yeah. And then we got ourselves the grandfather of the first-person shooter, Wolfenstein 3D. Which, by the way, spoiler alert, if we were going to have a best game by new studio category, this was going to win it. I mean, yeah, technically I know id Software existed before. They had Commander Keen, but Commander Keen actually didn't really sell well, which is the thing that people don't realize. Wolfenstein 3D technically was the studio's first major hit, and for good reason. A first-person shooter that actually worked. It technically wasn't the first ever FPS game, but it was the first game that laid the groundworks for the formula of FPS games from this point onwards. And even though, obviously, nowadays it is pretty clunky to mess around with, at least if you're playing it vanilla, play it with the EC Wolf source port, it will actually make it way better. I still at least do respect the game overall for the innovations that I was able to bring into for gaming as a whole. And literally, it's actually kind of a game that I still thoroughly enjoy, personally. But then we got ourselves Contra 3, the Alien Wars. So yeah, they made the third Contra game around this time. And if this game is hard as fuck, like, oh my god, I mean, Contra games in general are really hard. And it really doesn't help that in the North American version, you cannot use the Konami code. They got rid of that for North America and Europe. You can only use it in the Japanese version, which is like, god damn it, Konami. That being said, though, the actual movement and the shooting itself is still really good in this game. Even having the top-down sections, I actually thought the top-down sections were actually a lot more fun enough. I actually thought that they were as fun, if not more fun, than the like traditional side-scrolling shooting in this game. Which I know is kind of weird to say, but yeah, no, Contra 2 or Contra 3 is a lot of fun whenever you get the hang of it. Like I said, though, because it is one of those games that unfortunately makes you restart the entire game if you game over, which is fucking annoying. That's like the one, again, early 90s. This was still when games were still very arcadey. It's still a blast to play through regardless. And then we got ourselves 2 other vehicular-based shooter games. Space Megaforce and Axelay. Axelay was also made by Konami. But like I said, this one is more of a top-down vehicular-based shooter game. I'm going to also talk about Space Megaforce in the same breath as well, because they actually are pretty similar to each other. They're just overall solid experiences that, like I said, do kind of bring a similar feeling to that of 1943, just more sci-fi based. And as far as Super Nintendo releases are concerned, they're both pretty fun. So that's all I gotta really say, if I'm gonna be honest. And then last but not least, we ourselves a bit of an obscure title, and one that is definitely very weird, but I think is also kind of cool. Pocky and Rocky. So I actually don't remember who published this game. Excuse me. But yeah, no, Pocky and Rocky. It's actually a Commando. It's a Commando clone. And so it is more, it's like a cooperative. Yeah, it's like a co-op side-scrolling shooter. And this one takes a lot more inspiration from just kind of typical Japanese yokai, like mythological yokai. And it's kind of cute. As you can probably tell by this, I think this is from like a little manga thing that they did. And so yeah, like as far as I'm concerned, a bit of an underrated gem on the Super Nintendo that I actually wanted to give a bit of a nod to. So, again, it's not something that completely changes the game, but it's just still fun regardless. So, yeah! But anyways, let's go over the winner. So, the best shooter game of 1992 goes to Wolfenstein 3D. Yeah. 3 in a row, baby. 3 in a goddamn row. That's just, again, I know I've been giving a lot of praise to id Software recently, but you have to realize that is just how damn good id Software was doing at the time. In the 90s, they were on top of the world as far as innovating and helping form the modern conventions of an entire genre that is amongst one of the most popular genres of gaming to this day. But even just kind of besides that, though, Wolfenstein 3D, I still do consider to be a pretty fun game, admittedly more in short bursts, but it's still a decent enough of an experience with a good enough variety of different weapons, which, yes, they all use the same ammo, but they're used in certain scenarios. You're given a little Luger pistol thing. I don't even know if it's supposed to be a Luger, but whatever. And then you got your like little machine, like your SMG thing. I think it's supposed to be like an MP40. And then, of course, even on the cover here, you get to use a minigun, which is anachronistic as hell, but, this was the early 90s. Historical accuracy was just not a thing in gaming, or at least not yet. And just the fact that this game ran as smooth as it did for a game from this time, that's actually pretty impressive. So, like, the movement and the controls and just the actual shooting, surprisingly for a game from 1992, it works a lot better than you would think. And the first-person perspective, again, for its time, done pretty well. And like I said, even though this was technically not the first ever FPS game, as a matter of fact, this wasn't even id Software's first FPS game. That honor goes to Cataclysm 3D. And there's been FPS games since the mid-70s, I believe. But this was the first game that laid down the foundations for the next 32 years for first-person shooters. Like, it was really the spark that ignited decades worth of gaming, like an entire like popular genre. Without Wolfenstein 3D, FPS games, who knows how long FPS games would take to make, or at least make them into the ways that we know them now. And so because of that, I have to give Wolfenstein 3D the win here. And like I said, it's a bit of a guilty pleasure in the sense that it may have not aged the best. I still think it's pretty fun, especially with the EC Wolf source port. Just don't play Spear of Destiny. That is not one. That game has not held up. But the base Wolfenstein 3D has. Even though the robot guys can be annoying. Sim strategy. Oh shoot. Okay, there we go. Sorry, the mouse keeps disappearing, but oh boy. Sim strategy. Oh my god. This was definitely the hardest category to try to find games for. And it wasn't even close. Oh my god. This was so damn hard trying to find enough games for this. It was actually pain and torture. Because there was just barely anything that was even being made at the time, let alone anything that was good. But I persevered, and I was able to get just enough games. And these are ultimately what I ended up choosing. So, the first game we got here, we got ourselves Dune 2, which is the sequel to an older game that's based off of Dune, which of course is in turn based off of both the novels and the movie that came out in the 80s, although more so the books. And it's kind of weird because I feel like I haven't really talked about Dune all that much. I mean, I probably talked about it a bit on in the very earlier episodes in the series. But Dune is something that I am interested in. Obviously, it was the main inspiration for some of my favorite franchises ever. And so, because of that, I do give it a lot of respect. And even this game that came out, yeah, no, it was definitely a game changer. It was, well, because similar to Wolfenstein 3D, and similar to Alone in the Dark, this was also another genre definer game for its era. In this game's instance, the real-time strategy genre. So as far as I'm concerned, pretty important game, and also a pretty good one at that. And then we got ourselves Sim Life, made by the same people who brought you Sim City. They decided to make a life simulator here, where it's more about, well, more of an evolution life sim. So it's more so kind of simulating how evolution works and how, but more specifically animal life. Which I know if that sounds familiar, that may sound like it's going to be similar to Spore, but it's not. It's more of its own thing. And as far as being a bit more of an edutainment game, honestly, this one's, at least for its time, was actually pretty cool. Obviously, some of the information might be a bit inaccurate since it's been 32 years. But just the fact that they even attempted to do something like this and had a pretty unique style of game for its time, I gotta give credit. So yeah, Sim Life, one of the better sort of lesser known Maxis games. And then we got ourselves Fire Emblem Gaiden, which is another game that was only released in Japan at the time. Hell, I don't even think there is still an official, like translated version of this. But of course, this is the sequel to the first Fire Emblem game that came out a few years prior, and of course, just being more of a tactical sort of strategy game for the NES in this case. It's definitely a decent enough of an experience. It is a bit on the slower side, so do keep that in mind. But as far as being able to level up your different characters and being able to use them in like the battlegrounds themselves, it's just a decent little experience. And then last but not least, we got ourselves Comanche Maximum Overkill. Comanche is a series that I kind of regret not talking about on this series, because this was a combat flight simulator. And if you guys don't know, this is made by the same people who would eventually make the Delta Force series, Nova Logic, which is very topical since a new Delta Force game is going to come out real soon. It's already in open beta. So that's, and I've been playing that a lot. But this is not Delta Force. This is Comanche, where you're flying a Comanche helicopter and doing a bunch of hypothetical military scenarios. And this one, again, is going to feel a bit rustic, since this is a game from a long time ago now. But the foundations for combat flight simulation games, well, not the first game to do it, it was one of the first games to do it in a more grounded setting. And because of that, I gotta give a credit where credit is due, especially with the environments that they were able to pull off in this game. Again, 92 was like a very early time period for 3D graphics, and they were only really able to do it for PC games. And so, just that building of technology I find to be pretty interesting. And I do respect this game for helping laying the groundworks for other flight sims. But yeah, if I'm going to be honest, these were the only games that were really good enough for me to be able to nominate. Because everything else was just not it, man. So, yeah. But let's go over the winner, as always. So, the award for the best sim strategy game of 1992 goes to Dune 2. The Building of a Dynasty. I'm gonna be honest, this one is less to do with how I personally feel about the game, and more so just the general vibe and it laying the groundwork, like being like a fundamental groundwork for other games. That's admittedly why I am going to give this the win. So obviously this game helped expand upon the general world of Dune, kind of fleshing out a lot of the houses and some of the more military-based stuff within Dune, since a lot of that is kind of kept vague in the books and hell, even the movie, or the movie at the time. And so that's pretty cool. But I guess this one also has a bit of a this does have some technical stuff involved with it. And this is kind of a weird, obscure fact, but weirdly enough, this was one of the first games that actually used the mouse. Which is, I know that might sound weird, and I know that might sound like a small thing, but keep in mind that a lot of PC games, kind of before this era, they exclusively used keyboard for everything, including Wolfenstein 3D. You know, movement was typically you use the arrow keys here, and then maybe occasionally you'll have to like press a button. I don't know, like let's say like Q for example, or like V or W. Like you never used, you only exclusively used keyboard for a lot of games. Well, this game being an RTS game, which we'll get to that in a second, you kind of had to use the mouse in order for you to do a lot of the more technical stuff. And so having the mouse have a direct role in being able to use your units, that is a big deal. So again, it wasn't the first game to do it, but it was definitely the first strategy game to do it. And so, or at least one of the first strategy games to do it. And so that's like a weird technical thing, but trust me, that is like a common thing with a lot of games now. And so I felt like I have to at least mention that. Also, just the general UI and base management, I think is actually pretty cohesive for the most part. At least for the time that it came out. And, well, like with Wolfenstein 3D and like with Alone in the Dark, this is a very important game in establishing another major gaming genre that would become a huge thing in the 90s and the 2000s. The RTS, real-time strategy games. Again, they were kind of a thing, but this was really the first game that you could truly define as a real-time strategy game that we know it to this day. And that's pretty important. And so, yeah. Best sim strategy game for this year. Okay, mouse, stop. Speaking of mouses, don't go away. That's actually pissing me off. That, I don't know, apparently it's a Google thing. It's not a OBS thing. But anyways, art direction. So, being the early 90s, obviously everything is going to be more pixel based. And so it's going to be a lot harder for me to judge how a game looks because it's going to be like everything is going to be sprite based no matter what. So I guess this one's going to be the most vibes based. Though I think I ultimately ended up choosing possibly the best candidates for this. Except for maybe one, but it just felt wrong for me to not acknowledge it, and I really didn't know where else to nominate it towards, so we're gonna acknowledge it here. So, but yeah, I'm gonna nominate Mortal Kombat for its sort of East Asia inspired stuff, along with being one of the first games to use digitized actors in a way that actually makes sense. Super Star Wars for, I mean, just the use of its look of Star Wars and just being an overall pretty cool looking game. Flashback, and then Flashback for its cool sort of mix of use of cutscenes and its cool rotoscope animation. But then we got ourselves two other games that I am going to actually nominate for Best Art Direction. Let's start off with the less obvious one first, Super Mario Kart. I know for much of the game, you're looking at a flat environment. I guess I'm just judging this more so off of the character designs themselves and them being able to translate it, a lot of them from 8-bit to 16-bit. And even just the actual look of the game itself, for what it is, this is probably the best way you could probably make a kart racer. And being one of the first kart racer games, it just felt wrong for me not to acknowledge. And admittedly, I still do kind of like Super Mario Kart, even though I acknowledge it's definitely not the best one. I just find it to still be kind of charming. And I don't know, Super Mario, or just Mario in general, is just an iconic, it's just an iconic look. And so because of that, I wanted to at least give it something. And then we got ourselves the other game that maybe not a lot of people know about, but is kind of a cool story and very, very fucked up on in a visual sense. We've got ourselves Darkseid, another sort of point and click adventure game that is also kind of a survival horror game. So, and yep, you see it on the cover right there. A lot of the artwork was made by the now legendary H.R. Geiger. And a lot of the visual stuff in this game, oh my god, a lot of it is so creepy, but also kind of in a good way. The gameplay is not necessarily anything to write home about, but the actual visuals in this game, especially in like the latter half of the game, oh my god, it gets like, wow. Go play it or watch playthroughs for you to be able to like see what I'm talking about. But oh my god, dude, this game it's a wild one. And like I said, there's some fucked up in a good way imagery in this. So I guess let's go over the winner then, I guess. So I swear to god. Okay, whatever. No, I need the stupid mouse. I'm sorry, that's really, really pissing me off. Google, stop making... Okay, I'm actually going to look that up to make sure that I'm not going to have to deal with that shit ever again. No. Okay. Okay, whatever. I'll have to figure that out later. But anyways. So, let's go over the winner. So, the award for the best art direction of 1992, without a shadow of a doubt, goes to Darkseid. I think this one just kind of wins by default, considering that it's made by they actually got H.R. Geiger to work on the designs in this. So I feel like this is one of those games that I feel like is kind of cheating in that sense, but at the same time, it's H.R. Geiger. His visual style is iconic with that sort of biotech look that he's done over the years. I mean, he was the one who helped create the visual designs of the Alien franchise. And so a lot of, funny enough, a lot of very similar designs end up being in here. As a matter of fact, there's just straight up an alien that just straight up looks like a xenomorph in this, which is funny. But even just kind of, with that, this is one of the most fucked up games I've actually seen. There's some fucked up shit that happens in this game, and this is a game from 1992. There weren't many games that were kind of like this, and keep in mind, this predates Silent Hill. So if you want some like cool like shit that isn't too dissimilar to that of the Alien franchise happening in here, well, this is your go-to. But of course, that gets us into the last point. This game, along with Alone in the Dark, really were the games that helped establish horror as like a legitimate medium for video games. Because a lot of games that were horror weren't really horror games. They were more just kind of horror adjacent. Like Castlevania, for example. I know a lot of people do consider it, oh, it's a horror game. Not really. It's more of a dark fantasy series, and it's more, if anything, action horror. Same thing with, so like, you know, something like, I don't know, like Ghosts and Goblins, I guess. Again, that's not really a horror thing. It's more of a dark fantasy. But Alone in the Dark and Darkseid, they are straight up horror games by the definition of horror. And so because of that, I'm going to give the nod to Darkseid. Again, look up gameplay or play the game yourself. It's no longer on Steam. I don't think it's on GOG, so you're probably going to have to pull up a hook for this. So, yeah, so that's all I gotta really say. But, damn, this has been the shortest stream we've done with this entire series. Because we're already at the game of the year. But again, that should just be really telling of just how dire of a year 1992 really was. Like, I'm gonna be honest with you guys. This is easily one of the top 5 worst years we've covered in this entire show. It's easily the worst year that we've covered in the 90s so far. And it's amongst one of the worst years in gaming history. Which sucks to say, because this was a really, really damn good year for music. And a pretty decent year for animation. I'm not going to say that was a perfect year for animation, because for every Aladdin there was a Ferngully. But, like, I didn't expect gaming to be this dire. And again, this isn't even coming from like, oh, this is from way before my time. No, because once we get to 1991, there's going to be a lot of games I'm going to want to talk about from that year, because that year had a lot of great games that I appreciate to this day. But 1992, not so much. This was just kind of a crapshoot. And it's not just me saying that. As per usual, I've been looking for games that typically have decent enough ratings or decent enough press for me to talk about, because I don't want to be talking about a lot of games that not a lot of people like to begin with. And even with that considered, this was really rough to try to go through. And so, ultimately, I feel like these choices for Game of the Year are easily the best ones I could have possibly chosen. It's not even close. So, what do we got here? Would you look at that? Only games we've already talked about. So, that should set the tone. So, obviously, I'm going to nominate Alone in the Dark for helping establishing the survival horror genre, and for being a game that is still kind of fun, even despite the fact that I wouldn't really call it scary anymore. Contra 3 for, despite the fact that it's pretty damn hard, it's amazing shooting, like the feeling of being able to shoot around in an open environment, and even changing up a lot of the gameplay by adding in some of the top-down mechanics, and even some vehicle sections, which were pretty nice. I forgot to mention that. Dragon Quest V for just being an overall solid JRPG game, and being considered to be amongst one of the best Dragon Quest games ever made. Wolfenstein 3D for its innovations on the first-person shooter genre, and for being an overall pretty solid game. Even, yeah, if the maze-like design can be a bit cumbersome for a lot of people, I still consider it to be a very important game, and still enjoyable to this day. Mortal Kombat for helping establishing a competitor to the Street Fighter series, and for being for establishing a lot of tropes that we see in a lot of fighting games to this day. And Ultima 7 for being a game that innovating on a lot of 3D tech for RPGs, and for having a lot of player choice being allowed in it. So, and keep in mind, the saddest part about this is that not all these games are major names nowadays. Which I think really just kind of proves just how dire of a year 1992 was. But if you guys know, you guys can probably at least agree that these are probably the best choices we've got. But enough about me. Let's go over the winner. What is the best game to represent 1992? Well, I think I've got your answer. So, the Game of the Year award for 1992 goes to Dragon Quest V. I know this might be an interesting choice, considering this is so far, I think, the first game that we've gave to Game of the Year that didn't actually release in North America until much later. And this might be a bit of a weird choice. But here's the thing about Dragon Quest. So, first of all, this game was a direct overhaul of the previous Dragon Quest games. Because again, all the other games came out on the NES, including 4. This was the first one to come out on the Super Nintendo or the Super Famicom in Japan. And a lot of the mechanics were instantly noticeable. A lot more faster loading times, a lot more of a graphical leap, and just an overall sense of the world itself. And it's helped by the fact that this game was the first Dragon Quest game that really did start making more sense with its story. And that's something to be given a lot of credit to. And again, like, as far as the actual gameplay itself, it doesn't fully reinvent the wheel, but it is just an overall solid game overall. And of course, with a lot of JRPGs at the time, it's pretty much got you covered as far as the amount of gameplay. But here's the thing about this game, and this is the reason why I'm giving this the Game of the Year. Out of even all of the Game of the Year choices that I listed, this is the only game that I didn't have a glaring issue with. Because notice how I pointed out some issues with all the other games that we talked about. Which isn't a bad thing, because obviously no single game is perfect, even including this one. But weirdly enough, I feel like out of all of the games that came out in 1992, this is the one that I feel like is the most timeless. Because overall, this is a fundamentally good game that could work to this day. And hell, they've remade this game plenty of times. So clearly it was able to reach the hearts of many. And just showcases that the fundamental core of this game is pretty good. And so, yeah, Dragon Quest V, like, you know, compared to the kind of clunkiness of Alone in the Dark nowadays, compared to some of the annoying shooting, like some of the most annoying like deaths that can happen in Contra, compared to the annoying maze design of Wolfenstein 3D, Dragon Quest V stands out to me as being just an overall solid game that you can play at any era. And that's ultimately why I'm going to give it the Game of the Year. So, I rest my case. And thankfully, we are done with 1992. But just to recap, of course, here are the awards we gave out. So for Best Action Adventure, we gave to Alone in the Dark. Best Platformer, we gave to Flashback. Best RPG, we gave to Ultima 7. Best Shooter Game, we gave to Wolfenstein 3D. Best Sim Strategy, we gave to Dune 2. Best Art Direction, we gave to Darkseid. And for Game of the Year, we gave to Dragon Quest V. As far as my personal top 10 favorites, this one is, again, a bit more loose. But if you were to ask me the games that I would say were the best games of 1992, I would say, in no particular order, Wolfenstein 3D, Contra 3, Super Mario Kart, Dragon Quest V, Final Fantasy V, Alone in the Dark, Super Star Wars, Mortal Kombat, Dune 2, and Darkseid. That being said, there were still a decent amount of games that were notable from this year. Though I will admit, I did throw in some guilty pleasures in here. Games that I acknowledge are just not good, but I still just kind of like anyways. And so I wanted to at least give them a bit of a shout out. So let's start with the games that I think most people are going to agree are fine. Cybernator, which was kind of a side-scrolling shooter that I thought was kind of cool. Wizardry 7, of course, another long-running RPG franchise that it was just a decent enough an experience. Might and Magic 5, Clouds of Xene. So there's been so many Might and Magic games, also so many Wizardry games. Again, both of these are just decent enough Western RPGs. Lunar, the Silver Star, one of the few Sega CD games that's actually genuinely really good. Really good Japanese RPG that actually just got remastered recently, so that's cool. Quest for Glory 3, again, just another decent Western RPG. Ultimate Underworld, yeah, the first like Underworld's like game in the like subseries of Ultimate games. I know a lot of people like this game, but the first person movement I think was just a bit too clunky for me personally. And so that's kind of why I didn't choose it. And then Thunder Force 4, like behind me, it's another side-scrolling shooter that I thought was actually pretty decent. But then, and also Wizards and Warriors 3, just being kind of a cool little like side-scrolling action-adventure platformer hybrid game. And then we've got ourselves all the other games that I will admit are not good games, but I just kind of like anyways. So first of all, Final Fantasy Mystic Quest. I know this is considered a joke as far as Final Fantasy games are concerned, and you know, because it is way too easy, but I don't know, I guess I just see it as more of an introduction to RPGs because of how easy it is. So I don't want to give it too much shit, because yeah, it can be like boring and easy for a lot of people, but again, you're talking to someone who does prefer more easier experiences for the journey rather than the challenge. So even though the story in here is kind of mediocre, but that's besides the point. And then we got ourselves Night Trap, which again I acknowledge is not a good game. It is not, but well, I still like the concept, you know, and you just using a bunch of cameras to try to take down like some random bad guys who just have been sneaking in. It's cheesy, it's stupid. It was also one of the other games that helped contribute to the creation of the ESRB. But I still find it to be a pretty decent experience. And well, I'm gonna make everyone mad with this statement, but once you hear it, you're gonna see where I'm coming from. This basically was a predecessor to Five Nights at Freddy's. I rest my case on that one. And then we got ourselves Nightshade, which I know this game is infamous because of John Tron's review, because He was shitting on the game. But here's the thing about Nightshade. This was okay. So first of all, this was made by the same people who eventually make Shadowrun for the Super Nintendo, which I think is actually a pretty damn good RPG for that system. But this was just another game that I think I respect more because of how different it was compared to a lot of other NES games. I mean, again, this came out in 1992, so like, you know, the tail end of the NES life cycle. And for being a point-and-click adventure game for the NES, that's actually probably the best they could have made. And I don't know, it's just kind of like I don't know, I guess I just kind of like the whole, like, you know, sort of underground superhero kind of thing. I mean, I know I'm not the biggest fan of superheroes, but I don't know. It's a guilty pleasure of mine. Again, it's not a good game, but I just like it. Same thing goes with Arcana. It's just another cheesy RPG for the Super Nintendo that I just can't help but just kind of like. So, and honestly, same thing with Yoshi's Cookie. It's just a dumb little platformer that I just kind of find fun. So, but yeah. God, I feel so relieved having to not talk about this year. Oh my god. 1992 sucked ass for games. It was so bad. Again, there were just so many god-awful movie license games. A lot of shitty NES games that were made by LGN released this year. A lot of just very mediocre to just straight up bad sports games. Just a lot of just straight up terrible, like, mascot platformers. This year is easily one of the worst years I've had to have covered so far this year. It's not even close. And I know this stream is definitely has been kind of unorganized, but I've been dreading trying to talk about this game, if I'm going to be honest, or this year. So, but that being said, if I'm going to be honest, before we end the stream, I do actually kind of want to make another announcement as far as this series is concerned, because we've only got 2 more years to cover. Obviously, I wasn't able to get them done before the end of 2024 because I'm literally recording this on New Year's Eve. If you guys are watching the VOD, but if I'm going to be honest, I'm going to give myself a break to finish those. I still want to like continue the series because I do thoroughly enjoy talking about a lot of these games. And this series has helped me discover a lot of games that I otherwise wouldn't have even known about. And so me doing a lot of this research has been a lot of fun. But I've been doing this entire series throughout 2024. And it's taken up so much of my time. And I feel like I just haven't been able to focus on a lot of the stuff I've been wanting to do. And so because of that, I think I'm only going to do the Caspian Game Awards because we've only got technically 3 episodes to do left, 1990, 1991, and 2024. I think I want to give myself time in order for me to be able to finish those. And so I think what I'm going to do is for 1991, I'm going to do that at the end of January. 1990, I'll do at the end of February. And at the end of March, I'll be able to do 2024. I want to be able to give myself enough time for me to be able to do other things. And so, but don't fret, we will still be doing the rest of the series. It's just, it's been kind of stressing me out trying to get all these done. And so I hope you guys at least do understand that. And I hope you guys at least are willing to understand where I'm coming from. Because there's a lot of things that I want to do for 2025. And I'm pretty excited about those things. But I do want to, at the same time, want to be able to get other things done. And so I hope you guys at least do respect that. So, and by the way, this is basically my confirmation that I am not doing a Caspian Music Awards. I am not doing a Caspian Animation Awards. Because, oh my god, this series alone has already been pretty long. And so, I want to be able to focus on other things. That being said, though, that's going to be it for this episode. If you guys are watching this live, of course, I am going to be doing another stream later tonight for the end of the year. And so I hope you guys are pretty excited about that. And I hope you guys thoroughly enjoyed me talking about all these games. If you guys did, of course, if you're watching this on Twitch, of course, hit the follow button and the bell icon. If you're watching this over on YouTube, of course, hit the like and subscribe. And if you guys want to support some of the other content, of course, hit the link tree down below. If you want to directly support me over on Twitch, you can hit the subscribe button over there. If you can't do that, that's fine. I'm just glad the guys took time to watch this. But in any event, I hope you guys thoroughly enjoyed, and I hope you guys had a good 2024, and hopefully 2025 is going to be pretty fun. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out, and yeah, bye.